So chapter 2 is all about the crime scene, and we're going to discuss what happens when you arrive on the crime scene as a crime scene investigator and specific details about what needs to be processed, how it needs to be processed. So in the first part of this chapter, we're going to talk about securing and searching the crime scene. So the three general priorities that rule on a crime scene are safety. We need to keep the victims, the suspect, the investigators, the first responders safe. So safety rules. It would not be helpful even at if we have evidence on scene, if more people are hurt in trying to collect the evidence over the safety. So safety is of critical importance. And then collecting the evidence, many types of evidence. So that could be not just the physical evidence, but also statements from witnesses and first responders, observations made by some of the people who are arriving on the scene, and then searching the scene and collecting all the physical evidence, or at least logging things that have been seen in the scene. So the third part is about preserving the integrity of the evidence. The evidence is not likely to be analyzed immediately, and so we have to preserve it. And so some of the, making sure that the scene itself is not disturbed so that it can be fully documented and studied, documenting everybody who is on and off the scene as they come, as they go, and then being able to collect and store the evidence safely and provide for its security and document all the handling of the evidence to make sure that we have a full chain of custody on it. So these are the general priorities that are always to be thought of. It's not so much 1, 2, 3, but just thinking of these things. And sometimes they contradict each other and a decision has to be made, and the lead investigator would generally make that. So on arriving at the crime scene, first we think about the first responder is going to be thinking about medical assistance at first. Is there anybody who is injured needing medical assistance? Ideally, as the police arrive, so do medical personnel, and the medical personnel can deal with the victims. But if the medical personnel haven't arrived first, taking care of the injured victims kind of takes first priority. Detaining any potential suspects or witnesses, so trying to quickly see who's there and make sure that they are retained for questioning and statements being taken. And then securing the crime scene to the greatest extent possible. And again, it's the boundaries are set and sealed off, and then guards are posted of some sort to make sure that they know who's entering and exiting that crime scene. Ideally, nobody is entering and exiting it until things have been initially processed. And of course, only authorized people should be on the crime scene. And then calling for any additional personnel as needed. So if a coroner is needed, if additional analysts are needed, if additional medical personnel are needed, and again, that's going to change depending on what the crime scene is and what's necessary. So when we talk about securing the crime scene, it's important to remember that the boundaries of the crime scene aren't the crime scene itself, but the crime scene and a little bit of surrounding area. We want to make sure that all of the entry and exits are included. It's part of the crime scene. So where it took place, but also that surrounding evidence, that surrounding area. And again, try to now restrict access. We don't want that crime scene disturbed once we arrive on the crime scene, so we need to think about ways that we can attempt to secure it. Depends on the physical crime scene. If it's out in the middle of the woods, it's much harder to secure it if there's a variety of people around. But ideally, securing that and then posting guards to restrict the access, maybe using caution tape to secure it so that the boundaries are clearly identified, and then keeping a log of everybody who's on scene, when they arrive on scene, when they exit the crime scene, so that there's a clear log of who was where at what time. And then again, we were considering preserving the integrity of the crime scene. So pretty much no other activity. So no eating, smoking, drinking, no littering. Also things that you wouldn't think of as being damaging, like don't change the temperature, or it stinks to high heaven and you want to open a window. All of these things that changing the temperature can change how how they examine the time of death, because a lot of times the decay is based on the temperature, and if the temperature is changed and they're not aware of it, then that may change their time of death estimates. Don't flush toilets. There may be trace evidence in the toilet that they need to recover. So truly do not disturb anything. And that can be really challenging, especially if you're also trying to deal with people and making sure who's there and who's not there, and security and safety. But that is what we're aiming for, is truly not disturbing the crime scene at all. And then we begin a search. Often there would be a documentation of the crime scene before the search was begun. But in this part, let's talk about different kinds of searches. And what kind of search is really dependent on how many investigators you have. The size of the crime scene are the two biggest things, but also sort of the location and the nature of the crime can sometimes be part of it. Again, we're trying to find all of the evidence so that later on reconstruction can take place. We don't know what might be there. So it might be huge objects like a car, and it might be microscopic traces like fibers or tiny amounts of powder residue that are left places. So we have a challenging task. There's 5 general search patterns we'll talk about. So one is the line search pattern or strip search pattern, a grid search pattern, spiral pattern, wheel ray, and quadrant zone. So the line pattern is with 1 or 2 investigators start at the boundary and they search in straight lines across the crime scene. In the grid search, you have 2 or more investigators also going in lines. However, instead of just all going in the same line, the 2 investigators go across. So one's going this way while the other's going this way. And the spiral search pattern is when you go on a spiral path from the center outwards. You can also start on the periphery and go inwards, but it's generally beginning at the scene of where they think the crime locale is, and then moving outwards. And the spiral is trying to make sure you don't lose anything. And that's particularly good if you only have 1 investigator and you want to make sure that you fully covered it. So you begin at the most important part and you start working your way outward looking for information. The wheel and ray search is similar, but you'd have many investigators, all starting at the center and going outwards, so that you're covering a larger area. You're trying to cover the area, but you can do it with a variety of people. And then the quadrant and zone search pattern is generally when you have a very large crime scene and you have many investigators, so you're going to kind of quadrant it off, and each team or each investigator covers a different zone of the large crime scene. So depending on how many investigators you have and how large your scene is, would determine, certainly a spiral search pattern is probably better for like places like in a house, or the line and strip search would work as well, and how much we need to cover different things. So here are some general pictures. So the line searches, they're going, up and then down and then up and then down. So they're all going in the same parallel direction. Whereas the grid search, one is going up and down and the other is going left to right. So that they're crossing over each other's paths, double checking that they're not missing anything. By the way, this picture is probably, if it's a little hard to see in the video, it would be better, you can see it in the book. And then we have our spiral going outwards. The wheel and ray, each one of these is a different investigator, so you need multiple investigators for a wheel and ray. And then the quadrant would be, based on the size, you divvy it up, and each investigating team or investigator picks a small area that they're going to search. Within that small area, they might use the line search or the grid search or the spiral search, depending on the size, but you're basically breaking it up. So again, secure, including safety. Now the book separates safety and securing the scene as 2 different things, but generally from what I understand in criminal justice, you talk about the safety is part of the securing the scene, is also taking care of the safety of people on scene and bystanders. So we'll just call that one thing, secure the scene, document it. Before you start doing the search and you disturb it, you want to do a document of how you arrived on the scene, search the scene, and then collect the evidence. So we'll move on to talking about the some of the other things in a little bit. But the last thing to say is really talking about the safety of the personnel and the safety of evidence. So it is important to consider the biological samples. We want to be careful not to contaminate them, so you're going to wear gloves and possibly eye protection, sometimes Tyvek suits, mask and respirator, and they're doing two things. You don't want to be contaminated by something that can be harmful to you as the investigator. You also don't want to contaminate critical evidence that might be analyzed, especially DNA evidence is very sensitive to contamination. So this is kind of like keeping that separate. Being careful about putting all contaminated gloves, all of the disposable items in a biohazard bag to make sure if you did touch something with your gloves that that doesn't end up being spread to you elsewhere. After you pick up the gloves, now you've got it on your hands, and the whole point of having the gloves was missed. So being careful about that. Being careful about getting cuts, right? We want no bloodborne pathogens, so be careful with sharp objects, syringes, razor blades, anything that could puncture you. And of course, we're not going to be eating and drinking and smoking and eating and chewing gum. That's less about you and more about making sure we're not contaminating the evidence. So those are the general impacts of securing and searching the scene.